Every age begins with a spark. For the Bronze Age, that spark was a promise made on a mountain and broken in a city of kings. The poets say it began with beauty, a single face that launched 1,000 ships. But it truly began with pride. And pride, as every empire learns, burns hotter than fire. Picture the Aegean world around 1250 BC. Palaces glimmered along the coasts. Mycenae, Tiryns, Sparta, their walls of stone, their gates guarded by lions. Across the sea stood Troy, proud and golden, its towers watching the narrow strait where all trade between east and west passed. Bronze flowed through that channel, copper from Cyprus, tin from the mountains, gold from Thrace. Whoever held Troy held the lifeblood of the world. But power never stands alone. The gods watched, and men listened. It begins, as so many disasters do, at a wedding. The gods themselves gathered to celebrate the union of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal and a goddess. All were invited except one, Eris, goddess of strife. In revenge, she threw among them a golden apple inscribed to the fairest. Hera, queen of the heavens, claimed it. Athena, goddess of wisdom, claimed it. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, smiled and claimed it too. To judge between them, Zeus chose a mortal, Paris, prince of Troy. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera promised empire. Athena promised victory in war. Aphrodite promised love, the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris chose love. And with that choice, the world shifted. Because the woman was Helen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus. When Paris sailed to Sparta, the gods tilted the winds in his favor. When he returned to Troy, Helen was with him. Her eyes held the calm of fate. In the halls of Mycenae, King Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and ruler of Greece's greatest host, heard the news. To him, it was not romance. It was insult. To every prince of the Achaeans, it was a call to arms. They had once sworn an oath to defend Helen's marriage, and now the oath demanded blood. Across Greece, messengers rode from palace to palace, summoning kings, heroes, and mercenaries. Odysseus of Ithaca, cunning and reluctant. Nestor of Pylos, ancient and wise. Ajax the Great, towering as a fortress. And Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the warrior born of gods and men, swift and doomed. The poets say that when the ships gathered at Aulis, the sea itself turned silver with their sails. 1,000 black ships stretched from horizon to horizon. No army like it had ever sailed before. But the winds would not blow. For Artemis, angered by Agamemnon's arrogance, stilled the air. The army waited, restless, until a prophecy was spoken. Only the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter would bring the wind. In that moment, the king became something more terrible than the gods, a man who would kill his own blood for ambition. The knife fell, the wind rose, and the ships set sail. When they reached Troy, they found a city prepared. Its walls were ancient, said to have been built by Poseidon himself. The Trojans were not mere traders. They were warriors, commanded by Priam, a king as old as time, and defended by Hector, his son, the shield of the city. The first assaults failed. The Greeks burned the outer settlements, but the citadel held. Years passed. The war became ritual. Raids by night, duels at dawn, pyres burning at dusk. The gods chose sides, Athena and Hera with the Greeks, Aphrodite and Apollo with Troy. Men fought, but the heavens decided. 9 years passed, and still the walls of Troy stood. Achilles withdrew from battle after Agamemnon insulted his honor, and without him, the Greeks faltered. When his companion Patroclus fell, wearing his armor, Achilles returned to the field like a storm unleashed. His spear found Hector, and Troy's heart broke. The city mourned, but destiny was already written. The poets say the gods themselves wept for Hector, because even Olympus loves the doomed. In the quiet after his death, the war slowed again. Both sides waited for an end none could imagine. Because in the minds of the Greeks, victory meant glory. In the hearts of the Trojans, survival meant faith. But to the gods, it meant balance, and balance would demand the destruction of both. The Trojan War was not a battle for Helen. It was a war for the soul of civilization, the moment when myth and history met, and neither would ever be separate again. Before the walls could fall, heroes would die, kings would betray the gods, and one wooden horse would carry the weight of prophecy on hollow wheels. But that part comes later. For now, picture the plains beneath Troy at sunset. Spears gleam like stars. Smoke curls above 1,000 fires. Across the sea, the winds whisper the same truth they have whispered for 3,000 years. That beauty can burn worlds, and pride can drown them. War was supposed to be swift. The Greeks had come to Troy expecting a single season of glory. A storm of spears, a burning city, songs sung before winter. But years passed. The siege turned from legend into routine, and routine into despair. The first months were filled with fury. Raids up and down the Trojan coast brought plunder and captives, temples stripped, villages burned. The Greeks believed each conquest would break the city's will. Instead, Troy hardened. Every child born during the siege grew up knowing the sound of bronze striking shields. The next generation of Trojans learned to walk under arrows. The Greek camp stretched for miles along the shore. A city of tents, black ships pulled up onto sand, the air thick with the smell of salt and blood. Here, the greatest heroes of the age became prisoners of their own victory. Agamemnon ruled through fear, not love. Menelaus brooded over Helen, his prize turned ghost. Odysseus schemed, testing the patience of gods and generals alike. Ajax sharpened his weapons each night, dreaming of glory that refused to come. But the heart of the war beat in Achilles, half god, half man, the embodiment of everything terrible and beautiful about the Greeks. His tent stood apart from the others, closer to the surf, as if even the sea belonged to him. Achilles had come for fame. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, had told him the truth before he sailed. If you remain at home, your life will be long but forgotten. If you go to Troy, you will die young, but your name will never fade. He had chosen immortality through death, a bargain the gods always honor too well. For 9 years, the Greeks fought without progress. Each summer they stormed the walls. Each winter they buried their dead. Troy's towers remained unbroken, its gates unyielding. The gods turned the battlefield into a chessboard. Apollo guiding Trojan arrows, Athena steadying Greek spears. Heroes fell by divine whim, not strategy. The songs speak of single combats that lasted from dawn until dusk. Warriors meeting in dust and sunlight while armies paused to watch. In those moments, war became theater. Men sought not survival, but remembrance. To die before witnesses was to win eternity. Yet glory began to rot. The spoils of each campaign brought envy, not honor. Agamemnon claimed more than his share, hoarding captives and gold. When he seized Briseis, the woman promised to Achilles, the alliance fractured. The best of the Achaeans withdrew from battle, and with him went their hope. Without Achilles, the Greeks suffered defeat after defeat. The Trojans, emboldened, pushed the invaders back to their ships. For the first time, it seemed the war might end not with fire, but with surrender. Through it all, Helen watched from the walls, neither captive nor queen, a symbol trapped between guilt and fascination. To the Trojans, she was both blessing and curse, the reason the gods favored them and the omen of their destruction. She moved through the palace like a ghost, beautiful, untouchable, hated, adored. King Priam ruled with dignity, though his heart aged with each son lost. Hector, his eldest, was everything his father could hope for, brave, loyal, mortal enough to die. He fought not for fame, but for home, for his wife Andromache, his infant son, and the city that had made him. In that difference lay the war's tragedy. The Greeks fought for glory, the Trojans for survival. The balance shifted again when Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, begged to fight in his place. Dressed in Achilles' armor, he charged the Trojans and turned the tide, driving them back from the ships. But fate is patient. Apollo struck him down, and Hector delivered the final blow. When word reached Achilles, the sound he made silenced the sea. His grief turned to rage, not human anger, but divine wrath, cold and perfect. He returned to battle wearing new armor forged by Hephaestus himself, a shield that showed the entire world, stars and fields, cities and oceans, life and death in eternal motion. On the plain before Troy, Achilles found Hector. No gods intervened. The duel was quick, merciless, inevitable. Hector fell, and with him fell the hope of Troy. Achilles tied his body to his chariot and dragged it in circles around the city walls, dust rising like incense to offended gods. For days, the Greeks celebrated while the Trojans wept. Then one night, King Priam came alone to the enemy camp. Guided by Hermes, he slipped past the guards and entered Achilles' tent. The old man knelt before his son's killer, kissed the hand that had taken his child, and said, "Remember your own father, Achilles. I have endured what no man on earth has endured, to kiss the hand of the man who killed my son." Even the demigod wept. He returned Hector's body for burial, and for a brief moment, the war paused. The fires of Troy glowed not with hatred, but with grief. The poets end the Iliad there, before the city's fall, as if even song could not bear to watch what came next. But history continues where poetry hesitates. The Greeks would not sail home. The gods had not finished their game. Odysseus still plotted, Athena still whispered, and the towers of Troy still stood. Achilles' fate was sealed, but not yet fulfilled. As seasons passed, the war consumed itself. Heroes fell like stars, Ajax in madness, Paris by a poisoned arrow, Achilles struck by fate in the one place Thetis could not protect. The Greeks had lost their greatest, yet their hatred had ripened into genius. They would win not by strength, but by deceit. A trick born of exhaustion, whispered by a man who knew that minds break where walls do not. The horse was still only an idea, a shadow in the cunning of Odysseus. But it waited, as all inevitabilities do, in the silence between battles. For now, the plains before Troy were quiet, the air heavy with the scent of sacrifice and smoke. The soldiers on both sides stared at the walls and wondered what they were still fighting for. The answer would come soon, carved not in bronze, but in fire and betrayal. The 10th year of war broke men long before it broke walls. The Greeks had grown gray in their armor. Their sons would barely know them if they ever returned. The Trojans still held their citadel, but each dawn came slower, each funeral pyre taller. The gods, watching from Olympus, had grown tired of the game. And when gods tire, mortals die. It began with silence. For days, no Greek trumpet sounded, no spear gleamed on the plain. Scouts climbed the battlements and saw only the smoke of empty camps. Then, as the sun rose, the sentries shouted. The beaches were bare. The ships were gone. In their place, one colossal figure stood. A wooden horse, tall as a tower, wheels half buried in sand, its head crowned with bronze. The Trojans gathered around it, bewildered. They had seen 10 years of deception. But this was strange. Some believed the Greeks had fled in defeat, leaving an offering to appease Athena, goddess of war and wisdom. Others whispered that the horse was cursed. Only one man doubted everything. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon. He stood before the crowd, his robes torn, and cried out, "Beware the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." He hurled a spear into the horse's flank. It struck hollow, echoing like thunder. For a heartbeat, the people hesitated. Then the gods decided. Across the plain, twin serpents rose from the sea, vast, coiling, divine. They swept toward the shore and seized Laocoon and his sons, crushing them before the horrified crowd. The serpents vanished into Athena's temple. The message was clear. The gods demanded the offering be brought into the city. Troy obeyed. They broke down part of their own wall to haul the horse through. The air filled with cheers, drums, and the clash of cymbals. Flowers were thrown before the hooves of the wooden beast. Even old Priam wept, believing the war was over. That night, Troy feasted like a kingdom reborn. Wine flowed. Torches flared. Musicians played songs of peace. Helen moved through the halls, smiling but silent. Something in her eyes betrayed that she, alone among mortals, knew the gods were not finished. When darkness fell, the winds shifted. Out at sea, a fleet lay waiting. The Greek ships, hidden behind the island of Tenedos, their sails furled, their oarsmen motionless. Odysseus stood at the prow of his ship, watching the faint glow of Troy's fires against the horizon. Beside him, men gripped their weapons and whispered prayers to any god still listening. Inside the horse, silence reigned. A chosen few, the best of what remained, crouched in darkness. Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and others whose names would echo through centuries. They could hear the laughter outside, the crackle of torches, the creak of wheels cooling in the night air. Sweat dripped. Time froze. At midnight, a single star crossed the sky. A signal from Athena. Odysseus pressed his palm against the planks. The wood shuddered as he pushed open a hidden panel. One by one, the Greeks slipped out into the sleeping city. They moved like shadows through streets they had seen only from a distance. Gods lay drunk by their posts, garlands around their necks. The air smelled of wine and victory. The Greeks lit torches dipped in pitch, crept to the gates, and opened them. From the sea, horns sounded, low and dreadful. The fleet returned. What followed was not battle. It was execution. The Greeks poured through the gates like a flood. Fire rose with them. Temples burned first, then homes, then palaces. The sound of killing echoed through every corridor. The gods of Troy, those same idols who had watched the city's birth, fell screaming into the flames. King Priam, too old to flee, took refuge at the altar of Zeus in his palace. There, Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, found him. The boy who had been raised to avenge his father cut the king down on the very stones once stained with sacrifice. Blood and fire mingled on the marble. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, the prophetess cursed to be believed by no one, was dragged from the temple of Athena, her warnings fulfilled at last. Andromache was taken with her child, Hector's infant son, who would soon be thrown from the walls. In another corner of the city, Menelaus found Helen. 10 years of rage melted in that single moment. The poets disagree on what happened next. Some say he raised his sword and faltered, others that he dropped it at her feet. Either way, Helen lived. The war that had burned the world ended with her untouched. As dawn rose over Troy, the smoke of the city merged with the sea mist. The towers that had once defied the world were now bones of blackened stone. The Greeks wandered through the ruins, hollow-eyed, carrying treasures they would never enjoy. Victory tasted like ash. Poseidon, god of the sea, watched from his throne beneath the waves. He had not forgotten the arrogance of the Greeks, their desecrations, their broken oaths. When they sailed home, he would remember. Storms would follow them, and the sea would reclaim its debt. Odysseus would spend 10 years adrift, his cunning tested by monsters and gods. Agamemnon would return to find betrayal waiting in his halls. The victors would die as violently as the conquered. The gods had used both sides for their amusement, and now they were finished with them all. Only one mortal seemed to understand. As the flames died, Aeneas, cousin of Hector, gathered his family and fled the city, carrying his father on his back. Guided by omens, he made his way to the coast and sailed west. The poets say he would found a new line of kings, one that would rise in a far land and name itself Rome. The ashes of Troy would become the seed of empires. For now, the city that had stood for 1,000 years was gone. Its stones hissed in the surf as they cooled. Its people were scattered across the world. The war was over, but the story had only begun. The gods had their entertainment. Humanity would inherit the memory. And from that memory, the West would learn its oldest lesson, that glory and ruin are the same flame, burning in different hands. Dawn rose over a dead city. The smoke of Troy clung to the horizon like a second sea, black and heavy. The cries had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the silence of aftermath, when men realize they have survived what they came to die for. The Greeks walked through the ruins as if through their own graves. They had won everything and lost the meaning of victory. Gold glittered in the rubble. Statues lay headless. Temples that had once echoed with hymns now stank of burnt flesh. The wind carried the ashes of kings and slaves alike. In the stillness, Odysseus watched the sun rise through the smoke and felt no triumph. The horse had worked. The city had fallen. Yet something inside him whispered that no mortal trick could succeed without divine permission. And divine permission always demanded payment. The Greeks had broken every sacred law. They had killed supplicants at the altar, defiled temples, slaughtered children. They had mocked the gods who made them victorious. The war that began with a theft ended with desecration. The balance that holds the world had been torn apart. Even as the victors divided their spoils, omens appeared. A red cloud lingered over the plain. A statue of Athena cracked down its face. When the Greeks prepared to sail, the wind screamed against their masts as if warning them away. But pride deafens even the wary. They loaded their ships and left the smoking shore behind. Poseidon waited. The sea that had carried them to glory now turned to vengeance. Storms gathered over the Aegean like a second army. Lightning struck the sails, thunder split the sky. Ships scattered, swallowed whole or dashed against rocks. Men who had survived 10 years of war drowned within sight of home. Each hero's return became its own tragedy. Ajax the Lesser, who had dragged Cassandra from Athena's temple, boasted of his crime. The goddess sent a whirlwind that tore his ship apart. He clung to a rock, shouting that he had defied the gods themselves. A wave rose and crushed him. The sea kept his body as an offering. Menelaus, Helen beside him, was blown off course for years, wandering through Egypt and the islands of the southern seas. He reached home older, quieter, uncertain whether his victory had been worth the ruin it left behind. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae, crowned in ashes and triumph. The people lined the streets to greet him, unaware that his true enemy waited not beyond the walls, but within them. Clytemnestra, his wife, had never forgiven him for the sacrifice of their daughter at Aulis. While Agamemnon feasted, she struck him down with an axe, the same blade he had once raised to the gods. The king who had commanded 1,000 ships died in his bath, and with him the last illusion that war ends when the fighting stops. Odysseus alone would see the full measure of the gods' patience. He had devised the horse, lied to kings, and mocked Poseidon's son. For 10 years, the sea would torment him. Each island he reached offered a chance at peace, and each time he refused it. Calypso's love, Circe's promise, Nausicaa's innocence, all abandoned for the idea of home. When he finally returned, gray and hollow, he found his halls filled with strangers devouring his wealth. He killed them all and sat in silence, the last victor of a war that had taken everything worth winning. The poets would later call it Nostos, the return. But for the Greeks, it was something darker. They called it Eight, the blindness that follows hubris. Troy had fallen, but so had an age. The palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, once blazing with bronze and gold, began to crumble. Trade routes died. Writing vanished. Generations grew up unable to read the language of their ancestors. The war that defined civilization ended by unmaking it. It was as if the gods themselves had decided that men were no longer worthy of remembering their own glory. Yet the memory refused to die. In villages and ruins, old singers began to tell the story of the war. not as history, but as myth. They softened the horror, gilded it with poetry. They sang of heroes and gods, of beauty and vengeance, of the fall that reshaped the world. One of them, centuries later, would gather those songs and make them eternal. His name was Homer, and his blindness became a kind of vision. Through him, the Greeks rediscovered their past, not as fact, but as identity. The world that had collapsed into darkness found light again in the rhythm of his verse. The Iliad told of wrath, the anger of Achilles, the futility of pride. The Odyssey told of return, the struggle to reclaim humanity after violence. Together they became the twin pillars of Western memory, teaching that glory demands sacrifice and that survival demands forgiveness. The Trojan War became more than a story. It became a mirror. Every generation would see itself reflected in its battles, the arrogance, the courage, the waste. Kings would model themselves on Achilles and die like Hector. Empires would rise claiming descent from Troy's ashes, Rome foremost among them. Aeneas, who fled the burning city with his father on his back, became the ancestor of emperors. In him, the Romans found divine legitimacy, the son of a fallen kingdom destined to build another. The gods had not ended history at Troy. They had only changed its language. But for those who had lived it, the war never truly ended. In every storm, the Greeks heard Poseidon's rage. In every sacrifice, they saw Iphigenia's blood. The towers of Troy stood again only in dreams, golden, unburned, unreachable. The lesson was clear and cruel. No victory escapes its cost. For every wall torn down, another rises within the soul. For every city conquered, a part of the conqueror dies. And so, as centuries passed, the ruins of Troy sank beneath the earth. Fields grew where warriors had fallen. Farmers plowed through the bones of kings without knowing their names. Only the wind remembered the screams. Only the sea remembered the ships. What began as the pursuit of a single woman had unmade an age. The world that came after would be smaller, quieter, filled with memory instead of certainty. But the story endured, reshaped, retold, reborn in every culture that called itself civilized. Because the fall of Troy was not the end of a city. It was the beginning of a question. What does it mean to win? Centuries passed. The wind still crossed the plains of Ilium, but the walls were gone. The rivers had shifted, swallowing the harbors where 1,000 ships once burned. Troy had become a name without a place. The world moved on. New kingdoms rose, new gods claimed the skies. Yet something in the human mind refused to let go. Men could forget the root of an army, but not the echo of greatness. The war that had ended an age survived not in ruins, but in song. Somewhere in the Greek world, perhaps on the island of Chios, perhaps in the dust of Smyrna, a blind poet began to sing. His name, they said, was Homer. No one knows if he was one man or many, a memory made flesh or a tradition given voice. What mattered was that the story lived again. Homer didn't tell the war in full. He began near its end, when all was already doomed. He gave the gods their voices back, the heroes their rage, the fallen their names. He took fragments of memory, half-truths, oral tales, broken inscriptions, and forged them into something greater than history, meaning. In the Iliad, he began not with Helen, not with Troy, but with wrath. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles. In that single line, an entire civilization spoke through him, a world haunted by the price of pride. He described not victory, but the moment when men understood what victory costs. Every spear that flew, every duel fought beneath indifferent gods, every tear shed over an enemy's corpse, all became immortal through rhythm. And then came the Odyssey, a quieter storm. Where the first poem was bronze and flame, the second was water and longing. Odysseus, the liar who had conquered Troy by deception, wandered through seas that punished his genius. The gods who once rewarded cunning now demanded humility. His journey home became a parable for every soul lost after war. the struggle to find peace after survival. Through these poems, Troy was reborn, not as a ruin, but as an ideal. The Greeks who had forgotten how to write learned again, using letters borrowed from the East. They carved Homer's lines into clay and memory. His words taught them what it meant to be Greek, not merely to fight bravely, but to remember, to question, to sing. As centuries turned, the story spread across the Mediterranean. The poets of Athens, the philosophers of Ionia, the historians of Herodotus's age, all looked back to Troy as the mirror of mankind. To understand the world, they said, one must first understand the war that ended the last one. In the schools of classical Greece, children recited Achilles' speeches the way later generations would recite prayers. In the theaters of Athens, actors in masks retold the fall of Troy to crowds who knew every line and wept anyway. The gods of Homer became moral metaphors, the heroes, examples, and warnings. The Greeks had transformed tragedy into education. When Alexander of Macedon marched east centuries later, he carried a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle. He visited the ruins of Troy before setting out to conquer Persia. There, he offered sacrifices to Achilles, declaring himself heir to the greatest warrior of all. To him, the war was not myth. It was prophecy. He would be the new Achilles, and Asia would be his Ilium. Empires rise by rewriting old legends. When Rome came, it too claimed descent from the ashes of Troy. In Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas, the prince who fled the burning city, became the ancestor of all Romans. His piety, his suffering, his journey west became Rome's divine origin story. Troy had fallen so that Rome might rise. Virgil's verses mirrored Homer's, but they spoke with imperial certainty. Where Achilles sought glory and Odysseus sought home, Aeneas sought duty, the sacrifice of self for the future. The Romans believed that by inheriting Troy's ashes, they had inherited its destiny. In their triumphs, they saw justice. In their conquests, divine will. But every ruin begins as a temple. Long after Rome turned to dust, the story endured. Monks copied the epics by candlelight, their Latin translations carried through the dark corridors of the Middle Ages. To them, Troy was a moral tale, a warning against lust, pride, and false gods. Medieval kings traced their bloodlines to Trojan princes. Crusaders imagined themselves avenging ancient wrongs. In every century, Troy returned in a different mask. Renaissance scholars rediscovered Homer in his own language, and artists gave him color again. Painters imagined Helen glowing like dawn, Achilles raging like fire, Priam kneeling in grief. The ruins of Troy became a metaphor for the fragility of beauty. Even as Europe tore itself apart in new wars, poets whispered of the old one, as if to remind themselves that no victory lasts, but art does. Then came the modern world, armed not with swords, but with shovels. In the late 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived at a hill in northwestern Anatolia, convinced he had found the lost city. He dug with zeal, not method, destroying as much as he uncovered. Beneath layers of earth, he found walls, gold, and ash. Scholars would later debate whether it was truly Troy, or one of many cities built and burned on that same ground. But the discovery mattered less than the confirmation that myth had roots. Beneath the poetry, there had been fire. Beneath the legend, truth. Modern archaeology would reveal that Troy had fallen more than once, its towers rebuilt over centuries, its people trading as much as they fought. The Trojan War may never have happened exactly as Homer told it, but something like it had burned there around the 13th century BC, when an age of kings collapsed in simultaneous ruin across the Mediterranean. The poet S. had preserved what history forgot, the feeling of the end of a world. And so the legend persists, part history, part warning, part dream. Every civilization since has found itself in its reflection. The Greeks saw heroism, the Romans saw destiny, the Christians saw sin, the modern world sees itself. Because the fall of Troy is not a story about ancient walls, it is about the structure of human desire. the need to possess what cannot be possessed. The belief that beauty, power, or certainty can ever be truly ours. When we speak of Helen, we speak of longing. When we speak of Achilles, we speak of pride. When we speak of Troy, we speak of ourselves, of everything civilization builds and everything it cannot save. The city burned, but the idea survived. It crossed oceans, languages, religions, and centuries. It became the first great mirror in which the West saw both its glory and its guilt. Some stories refuse to die because they are not stories at all. They are patterns in the human soul. Troy is one of them. It is the fire that civilization carries inside, the memory that hums beneath every new beginning. Empires rise, languages change, faiths come and go, but the dream of Troy remains. Because it was never only about a city. It was about what it means to be human. When the modern world looks back at the Bronze Age, it sees smoke and poetry. But if you listen closely, through the static of time, you can still hear the voices, the clang of bronze on shield, the cries over broken walls, the slow, terrible hush that follows the end of something that believed it was eternal. Troy is not the first city to burn. It will not be the last. But it became the first to teach us what burning means. From Homer's verses to Virgil's elegies, from Renaissance frescoes to cinema screens, the fall of Troy has been retold in every medium humans have ever invented. Each generation shapes it to its own anxieties. The ancients used it to define virtue. The medieval world used it to warn of sin. The Enlightenment turned it into allegory. The modern world treats it as prophecy. We no longer believe in gods who hurl thunderbolts, but we still kneel to our own. Power, desire, revenge. The same forces that doomed Troy still sit behind the glass of our machines and the walls of our cities. The names have changed. The outcome never does. What Homer left us was not nostalgia, but diagnosis. He understood that war does not begin on battlefields. It begins in longing, the need to possess, to prove, to be remembered. Helen was never just a woman. She was the symbol of everything human beings destroy themselves to own. Achilles was not simply a warrior. He was the child of every ambition that burns too brightly. That is why the story endures. It is not a tale of gods and kings, but of choices that never change. When archaeologists unearthed Troy's bones beneath layers of earth, they found more than ruins. They found continuity. Beneath every civilization lies another, buried and waiting. We build over our mistakes, not apart from them. The ground remembers everything we try to forget. Even now, travelers walk the windy hills above Hisarlik, the site believed to be ancient Troy. The stones are pale and sun-worn, the grass dry and thin. From the ridge, you can see the Dardanelles, the same narrow waterway where the Greek fleet once anchored. The sea is quiet, as if exhausted by millennia of memory. It is easy to imagine that beneath that calm, something stirs. The ghosts of the ships, the prayers of the doomed. And yet, it is peaceful. Time has finished its work. The world has forgiven what it cannot remember in detail. That is how myth becomes mercy. The fall of Troy shaped the imagination of the West more profoundly than any single event that may have inspired it. Its logic, pride before ruin, glory before guilt, became the structure of Western storytelling. Every tragedy, every epic, every political speech that promises destiny or warns of downfall speaks its language. When Shakespeare wrote of Caesar's death, when Shelley wrote of Ozymandias, when modern nations built monuments to their own invincibility, they were echoing Troy. To remember Troy is to remember that beauty and destruction are often twins. The same hand that sculpts can strike. The same brilliance that invents can erase. That contradiction is the heartbeat of every civilization that calls itself advanced. In the end, the Trojan War did not end an age. It defined all that followed. It became the skeleton key for understanding humanity, the point where myth and history locked together, each explaining the other. The Greeks learned that fate is merciless. The Romans learned that duty is heavier than life. The modern world learned that progress is a kind of siege, endless and consuming. But the lesson beneath them all is older and simpler, that nothing worth remembering can be built on arrogance. The city of Troy burned because it believed its walls were enough. The Greeks suffered because they believed their victory was deserved. We repeat those beliefs in new forms, political, technological, personal, and we give them new names. But each time, the horse waits at the gate. It is built differently now, made of pride, ideology, data, ambition. But it still carries the same promise: glory without cost, triumph without consequence. And each time, we roll it through the gates ourselves. That is why the poets still sing. They are not preserving the past. They are warning the future. In the great sweep of history, the fall of Troy is a brief flame. Yet its light reaches across 3,000 years because it tells the one story we never stop repeating: that civilization is fragile, and that the same brilliance that builds its walls will in time find a way to breach them. When you strip away the gods, the heroes, the marble, and the myth, you are left with a truth as quiet as the sea outside Ilium. We destroy what we love, we worship what destroys us, and we call it progress. But even that truth carries grace, because from the ruins, something always survives. The impulse to remember, to understand, to sing. Homer's blindness became sight. The ruins became scripture. The memory of fire became a kind of light. So tonight, as the waves of the Aegean whisper against the stones where Troy once stood, imagine them repeating what the poets already knew: that the world will burn again and again, and each time someone will find a way to turn the ashes into meaning. The Greeks called that meaning kleos, immortal fame. But perhaps it is something humbler: the refusal to let silence win. And so, the story continues, from the bronze blades of the Achaeans to the digital screens of the present, from the ashes of Troy to every city that believes it cannot fall. Because Troy is not gone. It lives wherever ambition outpaces wisdom, wherever beauty blinds judgment, wherever the memory of fire still flickers behind the walls we build. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it: the wind across the plains, the distant thunder of hooves, the slow creak of wooden wheels rolling toward another gate. The sound of history repeating itself,